Hello everyone, Dr. Mad here. Let's get mad about poetry. So in this video, we are going to look at The Charge of the Light Brigade, 1854, by Alfred Tennyson. This is a poem about a real-life incident during the Crimean War, 1853 to 1856, between Britain and Russia. It's about a charge in battle. So charge means attacking forward by soldiers, where almost a quarter of the soldiers were either killed or wounded, 110 and 161 to be exact. It's a very patriotic poem at the height of the British Empire. And there's Alfred Tennyson. So Tennyson, 1809 to 1892, born in Lincoln, England, one of 12 children. They did used to have a lot of children in those days, but I would suggest that 12 is unusually large. Not that that's relevant to this poem. And he was taught by his father to love poetry from a very young age. He went to Cambridge University. He was the poet laureate, which means like a national poet, for a very long time, 1850 to 1892. In other words, to his death. And he wrote some of the best known poems in the English language, including The Lady of Shalott, Morte d'Arthur, which means Death of Arthur, King Arthur, Ulysses, and of course the poem that we are studying. And he initially received criticism for his poetry, but he persevered, which means to keep going, and look where he ended up. So that's encouragement for all of us. Okay, so there is the glossary for the poem. Please pause the video and try to learn these words, or at least read through them 2 or 3 times. So when you read the poem, it's a bit easier. I'll just point out a couple of things. So league means 3 miles. Brigade is a group of soldiers, which technically is between 3 and 5,000 soldiers. At least that's the modern kind of definition. The actual Light Brigade was only about 670 soldiers, but we don't need to worry too much about that. We're not looking at the history of warfare or whatever. And a Cossack is a certain type of Russian. This is a cannon. This is a saber, a light sword. This is a Cossack here. And these are all the techniques that he uses. So as you can see, quite a lot. Okay, so I'm going to move on. So let's listen to the poem and then we'll go through it.
Half a league, half a league, half a league onward, all in the valley of death rode the 600. Forward the Light Brigade, charge for the guns, he said. Into the valley of death rode the 600. Forward the Light Brigade! Was there a man dismayed? Not though the soldier knew someone had blundered. Theirs not to make reply, theirs not to reason why, theirs but to do and die. Into the valley of death rode the 600. Cannon to the right of them, cannon to the left of them, cannon in front of them, volleyed and thundered, stormed at with shot and shell. Boldly they rode and well, into the jaws of death, into the mouth of hell rode the 600. Flashed all their sabres bare, flashed as they turned in air, sabring the gunners there, charging an army, while all the world wondered. Plunged in the battery smoke, right through the line they broke. Cossack and Russian reeled from the sabre stroke, shattered and sundered. Then they rode back, but not the 600. Cannon to the right of them, cannon to the left of them, cannon behind them, volleyed and thundered, stormed at with shot and shell, while horse and hero fell. They that had fought so well came through the jaws of death, back from the mouth of hell, all that was left of them, left of 600. When can their glory fade? Oh, the wild charge they made, all the world wondered. Honour the charge they made, honour the Light Brigade, noble 600.
Okay, quite a long poem, although because the lines are short, it's not as long as you might think. So let's go through the poem. Starts off with a technique which he uses a lot in the poem, repetition of this phrase here. So remember, half a league would be about 1.5 miles. So this is the sort of area that we're talking about. And then valley of death. So kind of a metaphor, but in a way literal, really, because a lot of the soldiers were indeed killed. But it's also a reference to the Bible, and obviously we've got the 600, although technically there were about 670. And these are the commands from the commander, and they follow his orders without question. And there's another line from the commander, and then we have a rhetorical question, which is another technique that he uses quite a lot in this poem, the poet. And so dismayed means to be kind of concerned or distressed. And obviously the answer here is no, they weren't. Now, these two lines are a bit confusing. This whole poem is not that difficult, really, relatively speaking. But these two lines are a bit confusing because initially they might suggest to you that the soldiers were not aware that the order was a mistake. So blundered means to make a mistake. So, but this actually means that they knew. Yeah. So they were not dismayed, even though they knew that the order was a mistake. And here, it's not their place to answer back, to ask for reasons, right? Their job is to just die, because we are talking about the Victorian era, height of the British Empire. People were respectful of authority. They followed orders. And here we've got the repetition of the valley of death. So lots of repetition, both close together, but also spread out throughout the poem. And there's another repetition there. And here you can see, again, repetition. So they're being fired at from all sides. And here we've got onomatopoeia, okay? And here we've got alliteration as well. So lots of techniques to do with sound, alliteration and onomatopoeia, recreating the sounds of battle, okay? Bravely, they rode. And then now we've got jaws of death. So we've got these different jaws of death, mouth of death, or mouth of hell, or valley of death. And we've got the 600 again. And their swords, the light swords, these things here, are flashing in the sun, maybe. And sabering is a verb, right? To sword, to saber. But remember, it's swords against guns. So the Russians had these big guns, but the British soldiers just had these little swords. But they charge at the enemy army anyway. And this line here could be to do in two ways. Number one, that the world is wondering at the soldiers' bravery, but also possibly about these incompetent orders that were given. Plunged means to dive in, to jump in. So this smoke here, when the guns go off, they create a lot of smoke. And despite everything, despite the odds, the British soldiers managed to break through the Russian lines. So Cossack and Russian, so this is a type of Russian from that same kind of area, same country. Real means to kind of fall back. So the Russians are falling back under these swords, and they are shattered and sundered. So sundered means broken apart. And now the British soldiers ride back, but not all of them, because we know that a third of almost a quarter were killed or wounded. And so notice that the first three stanzas are the attack forward. This fourth stanza is about the battle itself, except for this last little bit here is about the return, and the last two stanzas will be about the return. So notice 6 stanzas for the 600, even though we know it was actually about 670, and deliberately numbered. Yeah, so that's like a visual thing as well. Okay, and then this whole thing here repeated from previously. Notice there. In fact, the first 5 lines are repeated, but then this line is different. Horse and hero, alliteration, suggesting how the horse and the soldiers were kind of like one unit, and they have fought really well. So notice another variation: jaws of death, mouth of hell, and they're coming back. And then the number of lines in each stanza do vary, but notice that the last stanza is definitely much less than the others, maybe to reflect the fact that not all the soldiers came back. Also, you might notice that this stanza is longer than the others, maybe because it's describing the battle. And here's another rhetorical question. And obviously, the answer to this question is never. Their glory can never fade. And here's an exclamation. The word wild is interesting here. It could be interpreted in 2 ways: wild as in brave, but also wild maybe as in not very professional because of this incompetent order that was given, not very organized. And this line repeated about how the world was wandering in 2 different ways. But despite everything, the poet is saying the soldiers themselves have to be honored for their bravery. And to be fair, no matter what your views on war, one thing most people can agree on is that soldiers themselves are brave. I mean, they follow their orders, and the orders can be wrong. We can blame the politicians, but generally speaking, most people admire the bravery of soldiers. And ending with noble 600. So the word noble is to do with upper class, higher class, but these soldiers would not have been upper class, okay? But they've been, in a way, metaphorically promoted, elevated because of their bravery. Okay, so it's a difficult poem, really, although that is a bit of a problem, as you'll see in a minute. So, AO1, to be able to read, understand, and respond to the poem using quotes and references. And here are some possibilities. You don't need all of those. And actually, you might need all of these, and I'll explain why later on. But for grade 4 or 5, you don't need all of them. And then here are the techniques. So you might want to pause the video here and just match them up and make sure you understand what's going on here. Okay, so AO2, language, form, structure, plus techniques and terminology. So language means words and phrases. This means thoughts, feelings, images. This is alternative suggestions of a word. So for example, the word wild that we looked at earlier. So here are some of the phrases you could look at from the previous slide. In terms of form and structure, it's a narrative poem. So narrative means a poem that tells a story. And it's almost like a mini ballad, but it's not quite a ballad because ballads are normally much longer. It has a fast, irregular rhythm, which mirrors the fast but chaotic galloping of the horses and, of course, the chaos of battle. There are 6 stanzas, 1 per 100 of the soldiers. The first 3 stanzas are about the charge forward. The 4th is about the battle itself, except that tiny last bit, which is also about the return. And then the last 2 are definitely about the return. The number of lines in each stanza vary from 9 to 12, but the last stanza is only 6 lines, perhaps to match the fact that almost half of the soldiers were either killed or wounded. And also, I mentioned that the stanza which covers the battle is the longest one. Techniques and terminology. So Tennyson uses many techniques, but especially repetition and rhetorical questions. But he also particularly uses techniques that have to do with sound. For example, alliteration and onomatopoeia, perhaps to enhance the sounds of battle. Okay, so in terms of context, you could talk about the fact that it's based on a real incident and that it was written just a few weeks after the incident. It's a very patriotic poem. Remember, this means to love your country, about not questioning orders or your superiors. And people were very much more respectful of authority back then. So we're talking about the Victorian era. Okay, so you have now learnt more than enough to get a grade 4 or 5, depending on how you write your essay. Here is a quiz to test your understanding so far. So please pause the video here and answer these questions. If you struggle, you need to go back and listen again. Otherwise, I'm going to move on to the answer slide in 3 seconds. 3, 2, 1. So here are the answers. Please pause the video. And if you really struggled, then you need to go back. You should get at least 50%, but really aiming for 70, 90%, 100%. And then once you've mastered these questions, all you have to do is to add a bit more detail and convert them into flowing sentences and paragraphs. So you might get a question like this. How does the poet present the theme of patriotism in the Charge of the Light Brigade, compare with one other poem in the anthology, which we're not going to do here, but you could compare with Bayonet Charge or Exposure. I personally would compare with Bayonet Charge. I think these two poems go together really well. But you can compare with Exposure, because Exposure is also about war, although here the focus is on the weather. And this is a very anti-patriotic poem, so there's a point of difference that you could compare with. And you might start something like this. The poet presents the theme of patriotism by describing a charge in battle where almost a quarter of the soldiers are killed or wounded, but continue to follow orders even though it seems like the orders were wrong. The poet uses techniques such as repetition and rhetorical questions to do this. And the poem begins with the repetition of the phrase half league 3 times on 2 separate lines, which creates the distinctively fast rhythm of the poem. So distinctively means specifically to do with something. So in this case, this poem is very famous for its rhythm and obviously for its content. The fast rhythm and also the use of alliteration and onomatopoeia throughout the poem is perhaps designed to replicate the sound of the horses and the stirring bravery of the soldiers. So stirring means creating emotion. So about 4 paragraphs like that, plus an introduction and conclusion, a bit of context would be more than enough to get a grade 4 or 5. If you're aiming higher, you can move on. So let's look again at the poem for these things here. So tone and mood. So the tone is very patriotic. Yeah, that's clear. The mood, I think, has changed over time. So at the time, probably people would have felt equally patriotic. Maybe now people read this poem and think, hold on a minute, that was a bit foolish. The orders should not have been given, or at least not have been obeyed or questioned, and the commanders should have been challenged. In terms of rhyme and rhythm, now there are lines that rhyme, but it's kind of irregular. So, for example, League onward, death 100, brigade said death 100. So brigade and said, there's a rhyming couplet there. Brigade dismayed, those two rhyme. New blundered, reply why die, there's a rhyming triplet there. Death and 100. So the rhyming scheme you can see is perfectly regular, and obviously that might be to do with the chaos of war. The rhythm we've talked about, it's actually about 6 syllables per line, so it's called iambic trimeter. Very fast rhythm, matching the horses and the pace of the battle. In terms of language, there aren't that many really very difficult words and phrases, so we don't need to talk about those. I've already talked about these 2 lines here, which can be a bit confusing, so just make sure you've understood those. If necessary, go back and listen again. And I've talked about the double meaning or alternative interpretations of this word here. But much more to say about language, really. And then we've talked about the form and structure when we talked about rhyme and rhythm and the 6 stanzas and the numbering of the stanzas. And with context, we don't need to say much more about context. Okay, so an advanced quiz to test a short one here, to test your understanding of what we've just talked about. Please pause the video here and have a good go at these questions. I'm going to move on to the answer slide in 3 seconds. 3, 2, 1. So please pause the video here. Notice, as always, these are possible answers, so your answers don't have to be exact, but as long as you're on the right track, and also if there's anything you missed, make sure you learn it now. There's a wrong word here, in case you noticed that, but I've corrected that. Okay, so there are your possible answers. Please make sure that you're on the right track. And I'm going to move on to the next slide in 3 seconds. So 3, 2, 1. So you have now learnt more than enough for a grade 6, 7. Such a paragraph might look like this. Now up to here, it's the same as before. And I've added this bit here. Victorian society was very patriotic. It was the height of the British Empire, and the people were much more respectful of authority then. All of this helps to explain the tone and mood of the poem. Furthermore, the use of rhetorical questions is particularly effective in this poem, given that it is all about following orders, and rhetorical questions are ones that do not require an answer or where the answer is already known. So about 6 paragraphs like that would be more than enough to get a grade 6 or 7, including an introduction and conclusion. And then for grade 8 or 9, it's not about more paragraphs. It's about how you go about it and how your essay flows nicely from beginning to middle to end. Now, for your grade 8, 9, this poem is a little bit different because in many ways, this is a relatively simple poem. So unfortunately, I don't think there's any kind of words or phrases that you can analyze in detail to get your grade 8, 9. I think here the challenge is more to look at it from a higher level, look at the poem as a whole and how the poet uses all the various techniques to create the atmosphere of battle, bravery, and patriotism. And I think in this case, you might have to draw different phrases from different parts of the poem. So in this case, you might end up with a lot more quotes than you would normally, and you might end up using 2 or 3 quotes in each point, in each paragraph, which we don't usually do, which we don't usually recommend. But I think for this particular poem, you may have to do that. I mean, if you can find a different way of doing it, that's fine. But these are just my thoughts on the grade 8, 9 essay. And you could also discuss how attitudes to patriotism and war have changed over time. And again, linking back to kind of this thing here. And once you've done all that, you can complete the final task, complete the essay you've started. How does the poet present the theme of patriotism in the charge of the Light Brigade? Okay, so that's it. Hopefully you liked that video and found it useful. And if so, please do subscribe and tell all your friends about it. And I will see you in the next video for the next poem.